Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Expedited Regulatory Waivers for HOPWA webinar. Today is June 30th, 2022. My name is Valencia Moss, and I will be your producer for today. If you experience any technology issues with Zoom, please email Valencia at collaborative-solutions.net. You can also send me a private chat via the chat box. I would like to introduce you your first speaker for today, Crystal.
Thank you, Valencia. And thank all of you for joining us today. My name is Crystal Pope, and Collaborative Solutions is pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which is covering expedited regulatory waivers for HOPWA. Today's speaker will be Amy Palalonis, Deputy Director of the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing at HUD. Also joining the webinar along with me to help manage participant questions are Emily Fishbein and Christine Campbell. Today's webinar is being presented to walk through and explain the expedited regulatory waiver notice issued on June 15th, 2022. Amy will be providing us with information on the purpose of the waiver, or of the notice, explain the 3 specific waivers for which HOPWA grantees may apply, and the process you'll need to follow for a successful waiver application. In addition, she will cover a new operational flexibility the notice provides related to conducting virtual unit inspections without a waiver, and will announce another notice related to setting the HOPWA rent standard. Finally, we'll try to provide as much time as possible for audience questions at the end of the presentation. But first, we'd like to you to respond to a poll so that we can see who's here today. Please let us know who's joining us today based on these choices. Okay, thanks, Valencia. It looks like we have a mixture of experience, some relatively new people and other. So thank you. We'd ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the session, not in the chat. We may not be able to answer all of your questions during the webinar, but it really helps us to know what kind of questions grantees and sponsors have or are struggling with. We'll incorporate answers to these in future webinars or postings as much as possible if we can't get to them online today. But you should, as always, put in any questions you can't find answers to in the HOPWA AAQ. So we want to acknowledge that all of you as grantees, as project sponsors, and other interested partners have been somewhat bombarded with waivers and then more waivers, additional waivers, waiver extensions, notices, and program flexibilities connected to CARES Act funds and many other things over the past 2 years. This expedited waiver notice is a bit different from the blanket waivers provided for COVID-19 in the past. And because grantees will be required to apply for the waiver to be approved for their specific coverage area. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Amy Palalonis for an overview of what the notice contains and more detailed information on this waiver opportunity. So Amy.
Thanks, Crystal, and hello, everyone. As Crystal said, I'm Amy Palalonis. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing. I am going to walk through the details of the expedited waiver notice today. And I do apologize. There's a lot going on in OHH this week, and staff are pulled in a bunch of different directions. So it will just be me presenting from OHH today. So I apologize that you need to listen to me speak for about an hour, but hopefully I will provide you with the information that you need, and we will have plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. So the notice was issued on June 15th, 2022. And I believe Christine just put the link to the notice in the chat if you haven't already checked it out. And so the notice advises HOPWA, ESG, COC, and YHDP grantees that they may apply for certain regulatory waivers through an expedited process to help prevent the spread of COVID-19 and facilitate assistance to eligible communities and households that are economically impacted by the pandemic. Grantees must utilize the process set out by the notice to submit waiver requests and justification of good cause to trigger the expedited HUD review. And HUD will expedite its review of all waiver requests submitted under the process outlined in the notice. The use of this expedited waiver process only applies to waivers specifically stated in section D1 of the notice. Grantees are able to request other regulatory waivers not identified in the notice as needed to operate their programs. However, they will not be subject to the expedited process. If a grantee requests waivers under the expedited process and the general process simultaneously, HUD will respond first to the waiver request covered by the expedited process, and then after that, we'll respond to the remaining waiver requests covered by the general process. Next slide, please. So the expedited notice details 3 HOPWA activities for which grantees may request waivers of requirements. They include time limits for short-term housing facilities and short-term rent, mortgage, and utility payments, HOPWA space and security requirements, and documentation of income and HIV status information. So these waivers should all be familiar to many of you, as they were included in the waiver memos that were issued throughout the first 2 years of the pandemic. The waiver process in this new notice is different from the waiver memos, as these waivers involve a request process by the grantee instead of the opt-in notification process that was permitted under the memos. The notice also covers waiver requests specific to ESG, COC, and YHDP programs. And so not all the waivers mentioned in the notice are applicable to HOPWA. So as you are reading the notice, make sure that you're focusing on the HOPWA specific information and the waiver details specifically for HOPWA. And then finally, the notice also outlines flexibilities HOPWA grantees may use for virtual habitability or HQS inspections without a waiver request. I will talk in more detail about this inspection flexibility later on in this webinar. Next slide, please. So now, okay, so what expedited waivers can HOPWA grantees apply for? They can request to waive the time limits for short-term housing facilities and for short-term rent, mortgage, and utility payments. Grantees can request to waive the HOPWA space and security requirements, and grantees can request to waive the regulatory documentation of income and HIV status requirements. For each of these waivers, the effective period of the waiver may not extend beyond March 31st of 2023. What that means is if a grantee requests approval to utilize a waiver, the maximum waiver expiration date is March 31st of next year. Next slide, please. Okay, and then next slide. there we go. Thank you. So some of you may be wondering why an FMR waiver was not included in the expedited waiver notice. So that is because today, actually, we published a separate notice clarifying the rent standard requirements for HOPWA. The new rent standard notice provides some additional options and flexibilities that grantees can utilize to set the rent standard in their HOPWA program. Please check out that notice if you have not already. It was promoted through the HUD.gov HOPWA listserv today. A link to the notice is included on this slide, and we will also put the link to the rent standard notice in the chat for your reference. You should have already received notification about a webinar that we are planning for next week that will explain the rent standard notice. That will be happening on July 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Please participate in that webinar if you can. We recognize that people will just be coming off of a holiday weekend, so it will also be recorded and posted online for your reference. So we will plan to answer all of your rent standard related questions during that webinar. So for today's webinar, we are only focusing on the content in the expedited waiver notice. So we will not be answering any FMR or rent standard related questions today, but there will be plenty of time on next week's webinar to answer questions around the rent standard requirements and the new notice, explaining those requirements. And obviously you can also always submit an AAQ with your questions as you have them. So I'm now going to turn things back over to Crystal for another poll.
Okay, we have another poll for you, and I'll admit, we probably know how many of you will respond. We'd like you to tell us how much the rent standard being used by your HOPWA program, either the FMR or other option, tends to limit your client's ability to find and secure safe and appropriate rental housing units at this time. And Valencia, if we could pull up the poll that for people to respond, that would be great. Okay, well, I can see this severely limits finding units that qualify and clients' ability to access those units went up right from the very beginning, and that is not a surprise, and that's certainly reflective of what we're hearing from grantees and project sponsors throughout the country. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, and we hope that this new rent standard notice provides you all with more flexibilities in getting clients into units. And again, we will be discussing the rent standard notice in more detail in next week's webinar.
Great, and I will give it back to you, Amy.
Okay, great. So back to the expedited waiver request notice. So I mentioned this briefly earlier, but unlike the previous blanket waivers provided by CPD during the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic that were available for use by all HOPWA grantees through an opt-in notification process, these new expedited waivers covered by this new notice must be justified and requested by individual grantees and approved by HUD in order to be utilized. So for example, if both the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago want to use one or more of the waivers detailed in the notice, each of the grantees must submit a request to HUD based on the specific needs and circumstances in their individual areas. And grantees cannot begin using the waiver flexibility until approval from HUD is received. Next slide, please. So one of the waivers that grantees may request under the expedited waiver notice is waiving the time limits for short-term housing facilities and short-term rent mortgage and utility assistance. A successful request to waive the 60-day limit for short-term facilities and 21-week limit for STROMU would allow grantees and project sponsors to house HOPWA eligible households in short-term facilities for up to 120 days in a 6-month period, and to provide STROMU assistance for up to 52 weeks in a 52-week period. Next slide, please. Requests to waive the time limits for short-term facilities and STROMU must meet the following criteria in order to be considered for expedited processing. Grantees must document on an individual household basis that a good faith effort was made to assist clients to achieve housing stability within the regulatory time limits, but that financial needs or health and safety concerns prevent them from doing so. Written policies and procedures must be in place outlining efforts to regularly reassess household needs and the processes for granting time limit extensions on an individual household basis. The request must specify the alternative limits to be used in place of the 21-week and 60-day limits and may not exceed 52 weeks in a 52-week period for STROMU and 120 days in a 6-month period for short-term facilities. The request must specify the period during which the grantee needs to provide assistance under the waiver, and that period must not extend beyond March 31st of 2023. So something that I will repeat a few times during this webinar is grantees should be aware that the request to use this waiver is not on an individual client basis, meaning you're not submitting individual requests to extend assistance for specific clients. You're submitting a request to use the waiver in your HOPWA program generally for a period of time. And then the need and the determination to implement the waiver for specific clients is then documented in the client's file as you are utilizing the waiver. Next slide, please.
I think I advanced it.
Yes. Yeah. No, so you're good. So grantees should also be aware that waivers of the 60-day limit for short-term housing facilities may be requested for all HOPWA grants, including grants funded under the CARES Act. So for short-term facilities, to waive the time limit for those, you can request those for all HOPWA grants. But for STROMU assistance, to waive the 21-week limit for STROMU assistance, that can only be requested to be waived for regular HOPWA allocations only. HUD will not consider this waiver for HOPWA grants funded under the CARES Act or for the portion of a grantee's FY20 formula funds designated under an annual action plan for COVID-19 response. And that's because the CARES Act funds and the portion of a formula grantee's FY20 allocation designated for COVID-19 response activities already have those increased STROMU caps. Those awards can be utilized to provide STROMU assistance for up to 24 months. So this waiver is not needed for those funds. And this waiver of the STROMU time limits is only intended for regular HOPWA allocations only. Next slide, please. So another waiver that grantees may request for expedited approval is waiver of the HOPWA regulatory requirements that each resident must be afforded adequate space and security for themselves and their belongings. A successful request to waive the space and security requirements would allow grantees and project sponsors operating housing facilities and shared housing arrangements to place more than 2 people in a room, or reconfigure common areas of facilities or other spaces for temporary housing or quarantine services for eligible individuals and their family members affected by COVID-19. Next slide. So requests for the space and security waiver must meet the following criteria in order to receive the expedited processing. Grantees must justify in the waiver request why they cannot provide adequate space and security in accordance with the standard provided in the HOPWA regulations. The waiver request must also specify the period during which the grantee intends to use this waiver. But for expedited processing, the period must not extend beyond March 31st of 2023. And again, this waiver is not an individual client waiver requested for specific individual circumstances. The grantee justifies and requests use of the waiver program-wide, and then implementation of the waiver for individual circumstances is documented in program or client files. Next slide, please. So the third and final waiver that may be requested through the expedited waiver process is a waiver of the requirement to have source documentation of HIV status and income eligibility at the time of the determination of eligibility to receive HOPWA assistance. A successful request by grantees to waive these documentation requirements would allow grantees and project sponsors to utilize written self-certification for HIV status and income to document program eligibility, helping ensure that HOPWA eligible households are served without delays. Next slide, please. Requests to waive the income and HIV status requirements must meet the following criteria for expedited processing. Grantees and project sponsors must have procedures in place to obtain the source documentation for program eligibility within 90 days of receiving the written client certification of income or HIV status. Grantees and project sponsors must provide justification as to why source documentation cannot be acquired at the time of eligibility determination. The waiver request must specify the period during which the grantee is requesting to use the waiver. And again, to qualify for expedited processing, the effective period must not extend beyond March 31st of 2023. And again, I feel like a broken record on this, but grantees are not submitting waiver requests on an individual household or client basis. The waiver request is to utilize the waiver generally or broadly in the program due to community issues and needs related to COVID-19. And then the grantee or project sponsor must document use of the waiver on an individual client basis in client files as the waiver is implemented. So to recap, grantees must justify and request HUD expedited approval for waivers to increase time limits for short-term facilities from 60 days in a 6-month period to up to 120 days in a 6-month period, increase STROM-U assistance limits from 21 weeks in a 52-week period to up to 52 weeks in a 52-week period, house eligible households in smaller spaces, allow higher occupancy of a unit, or use reconfigured space for temporary housing or quarantine purposes, and to accept self-certification of income and HIV status from clients in lieu of source documentation for a 90-day grace period when determining program eligibility.
Amy?
Yes.
Before we move on, maybe we should check back with Christine and Emily to see if any questions have come up so far that perhaps should be addressed now before we get into the process.
So there was one question that was asked about how quickly will a grantee find out if the expedited waiver request has been approved?
That's a good question. So I don't have a specific time frame, but we We have received a handful of waiver requests already since this notice was published, and we are working on processing those now and getting responses out as quickly as possible. Some of the requests did not contain all of the required information. So in those circumstances, CPD staff will be reaching out to those grantees to get more information in order to make a determination. But if you submitted all the required information with your request, then you should be receiving a response shortly.
And Amy, we have a follow-up question. Will the response be emailed, mailed, or both?
We're about to cover the entire process that will answer
Right.
almost all of these questions that are in the box.
Okay.
So now I'm going to cover the process for submitting the expedited waiver requests. All waiver requests must be received by HUD on or before July 31st to be designated for expedited processing. Any requests after that date will still be considered, but they will be processed as a regular waiver request and will not receive the expedited review. So you have about a month to get any expedited requests into HUD for consideration. Next slide, please. So for all expedited waiver requests, keep in mind the reasons outlined in the notice for expediting the waiver review process. So grantee justifications should reflect these reasons, as well as the purpose of the notice, which is to help grantees and project sponsors prevent the spread of COVID-19, to facilitate assistance to households economically impacted by the pandemic. The requests should answer the following questions: why the grantee needs the waiver, the impact on the grantee's ability to help people living with HIV obtain or maintain housing if the waiver is not approved, and the proposed waiver duration, which may not exceed March 31st of 2023. And grantees should be aware that all submitted requests must state a justification of good cause in order to be approved. Next slide, please. So the notice outlines some examples of ways good cause for a waiver could be justified. They include insufficient staffing levels to carry out activities due to the pandemic's impact on the community or jurisdiction, potential negative impacts of the pandemic on assisting clients, including delays in identifying housing or the onset of housing instability, local pandemic-specific delays or limitations, such as social distancing requirements, delays in obtaining necessary paperwork due to office closures or staffing shortages, low vaccination rates or high hospitalization rates of people living with HIV. And then another good way to show good cause is to show local data related to the pandemic's impact that supports the waiver flexibility. Now, these examples, might not be relevant to each of the waiver requests, but they just give you an idea of the types of justification of good cause that should be included with your waiver requests. Next slide, please. So the notice outlines instructions for submitting the expedited waiver requests. Grantees must provide a justification of why each waiver is needed. Do not submit one justification for multiple waivers. Each waiver request must include its own justification. All waiver requests must be emailed to snapsinfo@hud.gov. And grantees should email a copy of their waiver request to their local HUD field office CPD
Hello.
director.
Good. How are you?
Christine, I think you need to go on mute.
Yeah.
There we go.
So no requested waivers may be implemented unless written approval from HUD has been obtained. So you may not start utilizing the waivers identified in the notice until you receive approval from HUD. And again, just a reminder that all waiver requests must be received by HUD on or before July 31st to be designated for expedited processing. You can still submit waiver requests after that point, but they won't be considered for the expedited review. So again, you have about a month to get any expedited waiver requests into HUD by emailing them to snapsinfo@hud.gov. Okay, next slide, please. So each expedited waiver request should also include the following in your email to snapsinfo@hud.gov. The email subject line should be expedited pandemic regulatory waiver request. And then in the body of the email, each grantee should include the grantee information, including the name of the grantee and the name or contact information of a person within the organization to contact with questions about the request, as well as the grant numbers the grantee is requesting the waivers to apply to. So this one is important and something that we have already noticed already, that not all of the requests have included information on the grant numbers. So for those situations, that will lead to some extra back and forth in order to get those grant numbers and then be able to process the waiver requests.
And in a lot of ways, that makes sense, Amy, because that has not been a requirement for any of the past waivers. And it will require grantees to look at what streams of funding they are using right now for the services and housing they're providing to make sure that they put all of those in there.
Right, that's right. So yeah, just make sure everything that I am discussing today is, for the most part, is within the notice. So just make sure you are reading the instructions carefully. And again, if you have any questions as you are reading the instructions, don't hesitate to ask. So this is just a note that all waiver requests should be included in one email. So it's not necessary to send a separate email for each specific waiver request. And this is true for all of the waivers in the notice. So whether they are HOPWA, COC, ESG, or YHDP, all the requests may be included in one email with separate justifications for each waiver request, but within one email to that SNAPS info email address. Next slide, please. So each request should also include the specific waiver flexibilities requested, including the requested effective period not to exceed March 31st of 2023, and the other conditions under which the grantee proposes to use the waiver, consistent with the specific conditions for expedited waiver processing outlined in the notice. And then a specific justification for each waiver that shows good cause consistent with the reasons for expediting the waiver review identified in the notice, and any required information identified in each specific waiver's descriptions. So requests that do not include all of the items that I just mentioned, or that do not include the information specifically required for each waiver will still be considered. Two things could happen in those situations where not all of the information is provided. It could either just lead to extra back and forth to get that information submitted, or they just might not receive the expedited processing and might just go through the general waiver request process. Next slide, please. So what will HUD be doing on our end to respond to the expedited waiver requests? So following submission, CPD staff will reply via email confirming receipt of the waiver request. For HOPWA specific waivers, the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing will review the waiver request and prepare a final determination for approval by the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of CPD or equivalent. And then grantees will receive a signed response to the waiver request via email. As I mentioned, CPD staff may reach out to grantees to ask questions regarding incomplete requests or ask questions if additional information is needed. Also, as I mentioned, we have already received a handful of waiver requests for HOPWA. We are processing those now, and you should be hearing from us shortly regarding approval or if additional information is needed for the request. So I actually want to just skip ahead to the next slide to finish out the expedited process before we get into the general waiver process. Thank you, Crystal. So people had asked in the chat if there was a form or something that should be utilized or attached to the email. So the notice provides an expedited waiver request template that grantees may use in submitting their expedited waiver requests. And again, this is within the notice, so definitely check it out as you are reading through the notice. And so the template provides space to include the requested information for each waiver. So ideally, grantees should be preparing one form for each waiver requested and include the appropriate information in the boxes in this template form. And again, grantees can submit requests for multiple waivers in one email, but then the email should have separate information for each waiver with individual justification. And this form can be used to justify each individual waiver.
And because so much information is needed here, some more than others, this is a good way to keep it straight between different kinds of waivers that you're asking for.
Yes, and just because I just see it in the chat now, the deadline for requesting the waivers is July 31st. So you'll need to email your waiver requests into that SNAPS info email address by July 31st in order to receive this expedited processing. Okay, so going back to the general requests slide. So I've mentioned a few times that people can always utilize the general process for requesting regulatory waivers. So if you would like to request a regulatory waiver that's not included in the notice, you can request that through the general waiver process. And the general waiver process is always available to grantees. Even before the pandemic, there has always been a general waiver request process. But it is more time consuming and does have a lengthier approval process than the expedited process does. So the general process for waiver requests that are not expedited is the grantee submits the request for a waiver with the grant numbers and good cause justification to the CPD director at the local HUD field office. The field office then reviews the waiver request. There might be some back and forth to make sure that all the information is there. And then the field office submits the request with its recommendation for either approving or denying the waiver request to headquarters, to the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing. The Office of HIV/AIDS Housing then works with the Office of General Counsel, which are the lawyers that work at HUD. So OHH works with General Counsel to prepare a final determination for approval by the Assistant Secretary or equivalent. And then grantees receive the signed response to the waiver request by email. So it is a more detailed and lengthier process to just request a general waiver request outside of this expedited process. But we did want to explain this to everyone, just in case you all weren't aware that you are able to request waivers of regulatory requirements at any time. And just a reminder that statutory requirements, so requirements that are in the law governing the HOPWA program, those requirements can't be waived unless the statute specifically allows it. So for example, the time limits for short-term, for STROMU, for short-term rent, mortgage, and utility assistance, the time limits for that are statutory, but the statute specifically says that that requirement can be waived, which is why we're allowed to waive it under this expedited process and more generally. But for example, the administrative caps for HOPWA, those cannot be waived because those are a statutory program element or program requirement, and nothing in the statute says that those admin caps are able to be waived. So next slide, please. And okay. So that was an overview of the expedited waiver request process. I don't know, Crystal, if you think it's a good idea to stop here to answer some questions. And then if not, I'll talk through the inspections flexibility.
Yeah, there are a couple questions that might be helpful at this point.
Sure.
If you submitted an expedited waiver request using a blanket justification, should you resubmit and wait, or should you wait for feedback from that request?
You know what, I would wait to see if there are follow-up questions on it. Because even though you're saying it's blanket, maybe, maybe it is more detailed than you think it is, or maybe we are able to work with it. So I would just wait to see if there are follow-up questions. And
the other question that is, grantees are submitting these waivers, not project sponsors?
Correct. So all waiver requests need to come from the grantee.
Did you see any in questions?
Yeah, I did. Amy, if you can take a couple more now.
Sure.
Great, thanks. We had a couple of questions about grant numbers and concerns from grantees who don't have their new grants yet and don't have their grant numbers, and how they should handle the requests since they need to be submitted by July.
So the question is, if they don't have 22 grant numbers yet, how?
Yes.
I actually want to see if the notice said anything about 22 grants.
Or whether they'll just need, maybe they just need to request it for their current grants. So we'll let you see what you find.
Yeah, can you submit that question through the AAQ? I would just, or if I have some time, I can look through the notice. It might say about the specific grants, if future grants, quote unquote, future grants are able to utilize the waiver or not. I just don't know that off the top of my head, and I should. I apologize.
I don't remember that being in there, but we can look it up. But again, I think submitting it to the AAQ is a good idea. That will give us some time to look that up. And if we have information that comes out afterwards, clarifying all of this, we'll make sure that's in there.
Great. We have another question that came up a few times, which is, will the field office staff be copied on the notification of waiver approvals?
Yes, that is part of the process. Is for the field office to be notified the outcome of the waiver request.
Great, thank you. Christine, do you see any more at this point, or should we continue?
A lot of them are kind of service questions, and we'll hold them to the end.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the unit inspection flexibility.
Okay. So you also probably noticed that the notice doesn't provide an expedited waiver option to waive the physical inspection requirements for HOPWA. But however, it does provide an operational flexibility under some circumstances to allow grantees and project sponsors to meet the unit inspection requirements through use of a proxy and technology. A waiver request is not needed to use this flexibility. So please do not submit a waiver request to use the virtual inspection flexibility. We've already received a few waiver requests to do virtual inspections, and those are not necessary in order to use this flexibility to utilize virtual inspections through a proxy. And so this flexibility for HOPWA refers to initial inspections only. However, annual re-inspections may also be conducted remotely by proxy if desired. And also, I think it's important to point out that use of this flexibility is totally optional. So grantees may choose to utilize this flexibility to carry out inspections virtually using a proxy, but they also may decide that they want to conduct their inspections in person, on site, and they are able to, continue doing that if that's what they would like to do for their program.
And Amy, I think that's a really good point. We have gotten a lot of questions in the AAQ over time about whether it's necessary to go back to doing in-person inspections, or whether, and also whether people, even though they've gone back to do that, when there's a spike of some kind with the pandemic and with COVID-19 in the community and a rising of concerns, I know that there are quite a few programs that want to go back to doing these virtually. And so I think this kind of flexibility, you could use it or not use it and then use it again, depending on the circumstances.
Yes, very good point. Next slide. So using this inspection flexibility, grantees and project sponsors are able to satisfy HOPWA inspection requirements through use of a proxy who conducts a physical inspection on behalf of the grantee or project sponsor with the assistance of technology. I just saw a question about who is a proxy. And so the proxy can be a landlord, a property representative, a tenant, or any adult associated with the eventual tenancy of the unit. And technology can include video streaming technology pursuant to a written agreement kept on file by the grantee and project sponsor. The notice says that more detailed guidance on this option is forthcoming, and it is. So more guidance is forthcoming, but that won't be guidance that disallows virtual inspection. So don't read it that way, but just more guidance is needed in this area in general. But in the meantime, through this notice, HUD is considering the use of virtual, HUD is considering the use of technology used by a proxy to conduct habitability or HQS inspections as meeting the HOPWA program inspection requirements. Next slide, please. So there are parts of this notice that we thought maybe some folks could be confused about, because it was talking about the inspection requirements for COC, ESG, or no, actually not COC, ESG, COC, HOPWA, and YHDP. And so it was talking about HQS generally, using HQS as a just as a general term, and sort of talking about the range of different inspections that happen under those programs. And so, as many of you know, HOPWA habitability inspections is what is required for HOPWA, but many grantees choose to utilize the Section 8 HQS standards when they do their inspections, and that is totally fine. And this notice is sort of is using HQS as sort of an umbrella term to sort of cover all of the inspection requirements under the programs. And so the notice outlined some items and equipment that the proxy completing the virtual inspection might need, depending upon whether they are inspecting for HOPWA habitability, HQS, or local requirements. And those include a tape measure, a flashlight, a circuit analyzer to test voltage operation, means to test smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, a temperature device for displaying the internal temperature of the unit, and then a smartphone or tablet fully charged and a reliable internet connection. And again, all of this is just sort of meant to be a helpful list of things to think about that the proxy inspector might need, depending on the inspection that the grantee or project sponsor is carrying out. The list on this slide and in the notice is not a specific requirement for all grantees. It's just meant to be a helpful list of things for folks to think about as they are implementing these virtual inspections by proxy.
Right, and we would really recommend that the people that generally do these inspections on site meet to talk about what a proxy would need, given the type of inspection you do, the circumstances under which you do them. And that would be the appropriate list, right, Amy?
Yes. Yes, good point. And just some final cautions and reminders for conducting virtual inspections using a proxy. So regardless of the proxy and the use of technology, the grantee and the project sponsor remain responsible for the conduct of the inspection. So any judgments made about whether a condition is a violation of HQS or a violation of habitability standards must be made by the grantee or project sponsor. The proxy cannot make those decisions. There may be some circumstances where the use of technology does not provide sufficient evidence to allow the grantee or sponsor to make an appropriate determination. So grantees and project sponsors must have policies and procedures in place, on how they're handling these virtual inspections and all of their inspections, whether virtual or in person, as well as policies and procedures on how to handle technology limitations if implementing remote inspections. And as always, you should be mindful of any other state or local or federal requirements that could come into play when conducting the inspections. And again, just to reiterate, this flexibility to conduct remote inspections via a proxy does not require a waiver request. It can be implemented now without HUD approval.
And is there an end date?
There is not, no, there is not an end date to this flexibility. As the notice said, more guidance is needed and more guidance is forthcoming, but that will be more clarifying these requirements as opposed to putting an end date in place or anything like that.
Great, so people are good to go if they want to use this flexibility.
Yes.
Okay. So we would like to remind everybody, thank you very much, Amy. That's a lot of information. And just as a reminder, the notice itself outlines all of the things that we've been through today. It provides the template and other information and links for you. But as people are putting these together, make sure that you get your questions answered. I know people are anxious to get their waiver requests submitted, but as Amy pointed out, it's going to be important for you to make sure you have everything in there and that you feel comfortable about what's being submitted. So definitely ask questions about this through the HOPWA AAQ, or request technical assistance, we're really able, all of the technical assistance firms are available to you to provide some quick help with this. You can ask that through the HOPWA Ask a Question desk, or you can actually make a TA request on the HUD Exchange. And there are a number of additional HOPWA webinars and informational sessions that will be coming up. This is only a partial list. We'll be making this available to people through the HUD Exchange later. The first of which is going to be the session next week on clarification of the HOPWA rent standard requirements, which I think is clearly a very hot topic for everyone. And there will be some follow-up office hours, because we can't always answer every question during office hour sessions. People will have more of a chance to get their questions answered in real time. And then pursuant to the rollout of HOPWA's Reset, Renew, Recharge, or 3R program strategy, there will be many other things coming out related to allocation increases and decreases, client-centered methods. The APR Caper tool rollout is something that's coming up, and there are many more. So we would just say continue to watch the HOPWA listservs for announcements, both on the HUD Exchange and on HUD.gov. Make sure that you sign up for those updates, or at any time you can go to either of those websites and see what the latest updates are. And so with that, I am going to turn this back to Christine, and Emily, to see what questions we have from participants.
Do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. We had a couple of questions about the STRMU waiver. And so, for example, a couple of examples, could the assistance be sort of backdated to April 1st to provide 52 weeks within a 52-week period before the expiration date of March 31st, even if the waiver approval is received after April 1st? So in other words, they have to wait for the timing to start until the waiver is approved. They receive the waiver approval.
They do need to start, they do need to wait for the waiver to be approved in order to use it. But if you have specific client timing questions around use of the waiver, I would submit those through the AAQ, and that will be the best bet for getting you a helpful answer.
Yes, and we'll make sure that those go directly to Amy and the other folks at OHH to make sure that they're resolved. But that's a good question, because there is language in the notice that specifically says you may not begin using these waiver options until you have received written approval from HUD. So what you've just said, Amy, is that there might be a little wiggle room with some individual clients that, that come in that short time between when you're still waiting for a response.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Especially
Thank you.
from you, nothing is black and white. So I would say, for that line item in particular, if you have questions about using the waiver, put them through the AAQ, and we will get response back to you.
Crystal, while I ask this last question, can you flip back up to the slide for inspection by proxy? Someone just needed some clarification on what that meant, and it was defined in that slide. But the question I wanted to ask was, are there any waivers for environmental requests for master leasing programs? We find our units, but have to wait a long period of time for the environmental request to clear properties.
That's a good question. That also, I hate to kick everything to AAQ, but that's just because I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to do more research. I'm not sure if the environmental review requirements are statutory or regulatory. All regulations can be waived if there's good cause. I'm just not sure about that specific requirement. So you could either ask your HOPWA program desk officer or ask the AAQ or your field rep. Either way, we will get you an answer on that.
And let's make sure that we make a note of that, ladies, as a follow-up for this one. Because,
Sure.
yeah, that's a somewhat nuanced question related to environmental review. Christine, is this the slide that you wanted?
Yeah, they were wanting to know what's an inspection by proxy, and so this kind of explains it. And we'll be sending out these slides, so you'll have this as a reference as well.
And we were talking about this one before, and this is really not any different than in a lot of ways from the blanket waiver about initial inspections being able to be done remotely in the past. They didn't use the word proxy,
Right.
But it's really just having someone else other than your staff going on site, whether it's a landlord or someone else there that could walk through and do the video streaming that the program staff could see. So I think it's really more of a different language for essentially the same thing.
Right. Thank you. And did we miss any?
We have a question, sort of a detail about the self-certification waiver. And Amy, you may have covered this, but it just goes to the details of what self-certification entails. So it may go back to the details that came out with the CARES Act funds. The question is, can self-certification be verbal to the case manager, or does it need to be written?
No, the waiver, the notice specifically says that the self-certification needs to be written.
Thank you.
And I'm seeing a lot more questions about, I think people are maybe confusing rent reasonableness and the rent standard. But either way, we just put out today a notice clarifying the rent standard requirements for HOPWA. And there is a link to that notice in the chat. And we are also having a webinar next week on Wednesday to clarify the information in that notice and to talk about the clarified flexibilities that grantees have in setting rent standards in their HOPWA program that go beyond just FMR. Yeah, and Christine just put the registration information in the chat, as well as a link to the notice.
We're going to toss this back to you, Crystal, to close out.
With no more questions?
Right.
Right.
Okay. Amy, did you want to say anything else in closing?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all for participating and for asking your questions. And I apologize if we didn't get to any of them, but definitely feel free to put them in the AAQ and you will receive a response. And I just want to say thank you all for your hard work. And the intention of these expedited waivers is to make providing assistance to clients easier during a very difficult time. But I do know that in a lot of ways, these things can either be confusing or put a little bit of extra work on you all. And I just really appreciate everything that you do. And again, never hesitate to ask questions as they come up.
And no questions are too small. So just to echo what Amy has said, we appreciate your patience. And, people are ready to help you. We can provide some feedback, but I'd say, excuse me, make sure that you print out the notice and look through it. I would say also download this this webinar, which does give you some step-by-step pieces as well. I believe that Valencia will be sending this out to all of the participants afterwards, so you should be able to have it in front of you. I think just making sure that you have some logical steps in this and making sure that it's organized before it's sent off. Again, come back to us for any questions. We will try to be as responsive as possible, especially within the AAQ, knowing that you have very short time. So we'll try to be the conduit to OHH for any sticky kind of questions that come up as this moves forward. So as always, we thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us. And thank you for all that you're doing to help HOPWA eligible households stay safe in their households. And thank you. And I will give it to you, Valencia, to end the webinar.
All right, thank you, everyone. As Crystal mentioned, yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation by the close of business today. The recording will be made available in a few weeks on the HUD Exchange. So again, you will not have access to the recording. You will get an email when that is available in a couple of weeks on the HUD Exchange, but you will get a copy of the PowerPoint. Thank you all for your time. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.